Okay, so welcome back to Cracks in Postmodernity. I am here today with Chris Arnade, who I first discovered through his book Dignity, which came out, is it 2 years ago now? Is it
Yeah, 2 years
2019?
ago.
Okay. So, Chris, you have an interesting background that's quite different from what you ended up doing later on in life. So tell us how you started, what kind of work you were doing.
Yeah, initially I got a PhD in physics, so I went straight from a math program to a PhD in physics, theoretical physics, and and after that I went to Wall Street where I was a trader. So if you've ever read Liar's Poker, which I don't know if many young people know about anymore, Michael Lewis's first book was about Salomon Brothers, bond traders on Salomon Brothers, and that was me. Or if you've seen The Big Short is another example of kind of a movie version of what I did, and they're pretty close to what I did. So for 20 years I was a bond trader, and then 2012, almost 10 years ago. Wow, I left my job to focus on what I do now, which I guess is photography and writing, or pop ethnography, or photojournalism of some variety. Focusing primarily on, I spent basically 3 years in the poorest neighborhood in New York City, Hunts Point, with a street family of about maybe a group of 40 to 50 heroin addicts, homeless heroin addicts. And I spent 3 years kind of documenting their life. And then after that, I did the same sort of thing across the country. I didn't spend 3 years in any one place. I spent maybe a week and 2 weeks in different places all across the country. I put 400,000 miles on 350,000, 400,000 miles on my van driving around the United States, going to various communities that were either, kind of like Hunts Point, that gets a bad, they're kind of, when they're talked about, if they're talked about at all, is in a negative light. Places that, I mean, that have been kind of summarized as forgotten America or what have you. And I turned that set of interviews and experiences into the book Dignity.
So you left behind a very lucrative career to just go and travel around the country and visit these kind of, I guess we could say, these forgotten parts, these parts that are not really given much importance. Why? Why would you leave all that behind just to go travel and see these places?
I think at a large percentage of what, I mean, I can justify it in multiple different ways, but ultimately it's what I wanted to do. I mean, I was happier doing what I do now than I was on Wall Street. Um, you know, Kind of the arc of my career, the three big careers, from a particle physicist to a bond trader to, I guess, documenting poverty, is kind of three. Each step is me getting further away from kind of numbers and kind of a very quantitative way of looking at the world, and moving towards a more qualitative way of looking, basically talking to people. Instead of sitting behind a wall of computers and kind of analyzing things that way, and thinking about the world through a very kind of removed framework, literally removed,
Mhm.
on a 40th floor of a building with 16 screens in front of me, flashing numbers, from there to kind of actually talking to people in crack houses at 3 in the morning. And it was, at a very selfish level, it's just, I've always been interested in learning. It was a different way of learning, and I was learning from talking to people. And that kind of Wall Street way of thinking, and that kind of particle physics way of thinking, and which is, I call, the kind of a very kind of utilitarian positivist framework of the world, was just, I was starting to question it. And going out, quote, into the field, as it were, and talking to people was a way of kind of addressing that kind of questioning. But again, to be kind of cliche-ish, I mean, you only live once, you might as well try do different things. So you know I've never really felt comfortable only doing one thing. I get to a certain point and it's time to move on. And then there was a political side, which is I was just becoming frustrated with Wall Street. The industry had changed, I had changed, I wasn't comfortable doing what I was doing um, at a moral level or intellectual level. So I moved on from that.
And one of the things that you said is that like you always saw yourself as someone who advocated for the rights of the underprivileged, that were who were in need. But then your point of view kind of changed after actually spending time with these people you said you advocated for. So like what was it that changed your perspective? How did it change after being with these people?
Again, I mean, I think anytime you think about a group of people and your only perspective on them is reading books or looking at data, as was the case, or reading publications through the filtered through the eyes of somebody else, it's very limited, and it generally comes in a very cartoonish framework. And what I came to see was a much more nuanced view, and I mean it completely changed my view on on so many issues. The 6 or 7 years of spending there, I'm an entirely different person in terms of how I think about things. You can kind of hear it in my voice now how I frame the old me, but I have a much less respect for kind of the scientific, a very kind of cold, technocratic, rational way of looking at the world. And at a very personal level, I have a lot more respect for faith. I have a lot more respect for a more nuanced view on the world. Um, and in terms of the actual people I spent time with, quote the normies, I've come to reckon. I mean, it's again, it's another cliche, but they are they're 98% of the people. I mean, we're the weird ones, and the people I was spending my time with in the past, both in particle physics, both on Wall Street, and even when I was posting on Twitter, arguing with people about politics, we're the weird ones. We're the kind of odd characters who have to explain ourselves to the other 98%. I feel awkward kind of explaining normies to the weird people. I mean, we're the ones who have an obligation in some senses to explain ourselves to the other to the normies. And so I've always knew I was weird, and I always knew I was different, but it was a recognition of recognizing that even what I wanted the normies to believe, what I hoped they believe, wasn't necessarily what they believe. And this, that puts me in a very, there's two paths you can go there. You can become very much an elitist and say, well, okay, they need to be taught. They don't believe it. Damn them. I'm better. I have more stuff I need taught. Or you can go the path of saying, hey, maybe I'm the one who's got it wrong. Maybe what they believe, even though it isn't necessarily my cup of tea, has more weight behind it than I've given it before. So I've generally taken the latter path, which is to question what I believed and to question what we quote the weirdos, the 2%, the elites. I call them the front row, the highly educated, believe, and so that hasn't always gone over well with with people, with people in that 2%, the front row. Front row doesn't like to be particularly told that it's weird.
Yeah, I mean, I think the categories of the front row, back row, it's helpful because it kind of transcends the conventional categories we use, like socioeconomic status, race, and all that, because, you know, you can be front row coming from a particular racial, socioeconomic background. That's not typically associated with those who are privileged. Like you can be a person of color, a woman coming from an impoverished background, but who kind of approaches the world with this front row
I mean, the
mentality.
perfect example of that, I mean, kind of my thesis, the kind of my cartoonish thesis that came out of the 7 years was that education is our biggest divide. And I kind of got, I got attacked pretty heavily, when I started saying that in 2015. I think there's a lot, the dialogue has moved kind of in that direction now, where I think a lot more people are aware. And I think that certainly saw that in the last election, that education is becoming more and more of a kind of a dividing line that people are willing to talk about in the same way they talk about the classic dividing lines of race and gender and income. I mean, all three of those other ones are dividing lines as well. I don't want to like downplay the differences that, I'm not going to say that we don't have racial differences in the country or wealth differences, and they often overlap. I mean, a perfect example, is Elizabeth Warren. I mean, she's about as goddamn front row as you can get, and she has an immense privilege, and she doesn't, she doesn't posture as that. She's just, a working girl from Oklahoma who, shucks, doesn't make all that much money and is fighting for the, fighting for the for the regular person. And yeah, she's every way, her entire worldview and her entire persona is extraordinarily front row. I mean, she's a Harvard law professor, and yes, she comes from humble roots, and but that was 40, 50 years ago, and she's been spending all her time. And whether she, and she didn't intend to become this person necessarily, you spend that much time in a culture, it changes who you are. And so I think she, and you can go on and on. There's plenty of others, people who very much, would say to themselves, hey, look at me, I'm, how can I be privileged? I'm the following. And, I used to say that kind of provocatively, intentionally provocatively, as an African-American professor of sociology at Cornell, is closer to a white bond trader than they are to, a white truck driver or a black kid flipping hamburgers in Detroit, because the black sociology professor at Cornell and the bond trader have more in common in their worldview than somebody who hasn't finished high school or somebody who hasn't gone into college. I mean, so I think education is very much, and that was kind of with a big reveal to me. And I kind of already knew, but like I can remember exactly where I was when I actually said, wow, I was in a McDonald's in Bristol, Tennessee, of all places, when I was just like, I would see these things out in the quote country hanging with normies. And then I get on Twitter and see people fighting. And I'm like, these are just so fucking different. I mean, it's just like, it's not even like, I can't even, it was frustrating because I can't explain. And this is one of the things that's frustrating as a writer and photographer, is when you see something, you feel like you can't do justice to it in your words or photos.
Yeah.
And, and there's my limitations there, but there's also the fact that the audience, who is primarily front row, who primarily has PhDs and grad MFAs and all those things, are so removed from what I'm trying to explain or what I'm trying to show that they are incapable of understanding it. And so it's a little bit of my failure, and it's a little bit of, I kind of got a task I'm not sure I can ever accomplish. I mean, the worldview difference between somebody who, has a PhD in comparative literature from Princeton, and it's not making a lot of money, because they're adjuncting from here to here, and somebody who was also not making a lot of money because, or somebody who's making a little bit of money because they have their own lawn care business, right? Like,
Yeah.
A Mexican American immigrant who started a lawn care business and now has 8 employees and is maybe making 150,000 a year. Maybe 3 times what an adjunct with a comparative literature PhD is doing. But they're very, like, I will still argue that in many ways, the comparative literature PhD has more privilege, because you're part of a club, and the educated club is the ones who run this country, and they kind of set the agenda, both culturally and policy wise. So, that hasn't gone over very well, because I think, again, it's very hard. It's a very hard sell, because there really are, there's adjuncts out there who have PhDs from places who are struggling, and I really feel bad for them, and I wish they weren't struggling. I wish it was different. And it's hard to say to them, hey, I think, I'm not trying to diminish your struggles, but, as a class of people, there's a lot of privilege here, because you have the right cultural views, you have the right knowledge set, and you have a lot more flexibility in what you can do or what you could have done in your career, to go into careers that are kind of are sacred or are approved by the kind of powerful, versus kind of being somebody who just toils away fixing lawns, and focusing on and always living in the same neighborhood their entire life.
Yeah, and that's what I find most helpful about the front row, back row framework, that it's like it's ultimately about your kind of cultural, almost metaphysical orientation towards
That's
life,
right.
its reality, you know. And like when I was reading your book, it made me think back to when I was in undergrad. Like I went on a service trip to Brazil, and a lot of my classmates were, you know, like very conventionally progressive and like, you know, said all the right, used all the right kind of language, all the right concepts. And when we were there, like, you know, we're in a very kind of impoverished neighborhood. And the main focal points of the neighborhood were the churches.
Right.
And we participated in one of the religious services. And the way that my classmates were acting, like, it was really interesting because on one hand, they looked at it in a kind of condescending way, like, oh, look how cute. Like they still have
Exactly.
all
It's
these
very
rich
cute. They still
people.
do this.
Or it's like pity. Because like if it's like the ritualistic stuff, it's like, oh, very cute. But then when it comes to like certain doctrines, beliefs, they're like, oh my God, they still believe that they haven't evolved yet. That's so sad. If only, you know, one day they would
Yeah, there
evolve.
is there. It's very much to me the again. I always said we're divided. You know, it's about meaning, and it's how you find your meaning, and it's what you value, what you view as sacred meaning, what you view as profane meaning. Like the problem with the educated class, or the what we in my issue with the meritocracy, the educated meritocracy now is they only really allow one axis of meaning, and that's resume building.
And it
That's
claims
kind
to
of
be neutral, though. That's the thing. Like it's so
right.
dogmatic while claiming to be like, oh, it's totally neutral, free of any.
But and there's no greater example of that than faith. And you know, at a personal level, I've evolved most on that issue. I used to be, you know, I've never made you know, like I was always a smart ass kid who kind of mocked religion. You
Mhm.
know, I never really made fun of people who are religious because that's just not who I am. I don't generally make fun of people, but you know, I did pity them and look down on it. Um, and you know, again, spending 6 years and you know, when you want people to have a view or expect people to have a view and they don't have it, you got to start questioning you. Am I the one who's wrong? You know, and I expected them to be atheists. I expected them to be, you know, if anybody's been dealt a, you know, who should see how ruthless the world is. It's the people I was hanging out with. And in fact, they were much more. They had much more. They were the most religious people I've ever met in my life, and I had to start questioning what I how I think about faith. And I think you're exactly right. You know, the educated class, the front row, really look at religion at best in a condescending way. Oh, that's really cute. That you know, that's a utilitarian thing. You need that. You know, it's kind of like the opiate of the masses. Oh, that's good for you. It'll dull your pain. They don't ever view it as anything, you know, or outright scorn. I mean, you know, you just look at perfect example, or like the new atheists are the worst example of that. They don't ever look at it as anything that is as, you know, at epistemological or metaphysical level is as valid as their framework is. And I actually think it is as valid. I mean, it's, you know, I think, you know, I think many cases the highly educated are the people who are living a sheltered life that's basically not allowing them to see the validity of
Yeah.
faith. And we're the ones who, you know, we tend to say, well, it's the religious people who are living this very provincial life, and they don't have access to the books we have, the access to the experiences we have to see, you know, that rationality and cold and positivism is a way, utilitarian positivism is a way to go. They're the ones who have, whereas I think it's actually the opposite. We're the ones who, with our noses always in books and our kind of limited social circle and our limited experience set, are are cut off from the evidence of the power of faith and the validity of it. So, you know, I think we got it all backwards, and that's the biggest change for me intellectually and personally. And so, you know, the way I see how I see faith talked about, and how I see religion talked about in academics. You know, again, it's there are places I get it right. Like, you know, you can go to, you know, Notre Dame and hear theologians who get it right. But you know, you go to Harvard and Princeton and Cornell, and you know, I mean, it's just, you know, it's kind of like a very, very like religions are this thing you put under a microscope to study, you know, and that, at best, you know.
And it comes out like I'm thinking about I think it was maybe last month Cornell West resigned from Harvard Div School because like the horrible treatment that he received as a faculty member. And he was saying that like it's so clear that this school no longer prioritizes like actual spiritual values. Like now as a professor, he's just treated as just a part of the machine, you know? So it's not just, I don't know, do you see how this kind of shift towards this technocratic worldview really does dehumanize people and like we
Yeah,
become
I mean, the you know, this tech, you know, the technocratic worldview is, I mean, again, I think, you know, it, besides quote, I think being wrong and soulless, I actually think it's extraordinarily dangerous. I mean, one of my quips has always been is, you know, kind of technocratic, you know, basically cold technocrats, bureaucrats playing sim nation or sim world
Mhm.
with quote science as their, you know, guiding principle generally ends in bad places. It ends in eugenics. You know, I mean, it ends in, you know, it ends in, you know, elitism. It ends in scientific racism. It ends in these places that aren't good. You know, if you just quote follow the data without having a moral structure behind it. Same thing with capitalism. You know, if you have free markets without kind of a moral code behind it to kind of to check the excesses, that also leads in a really bad way. And I think what we're seeing here in terms of like, you know, so much of what the problems we see now, look, we're an extraordinarily wealthy country. We have a lot of stuff, and yet people are unhappy. We're extraordinarily politically polarized. And I think that lack of faith as giving people a role, giving people a community, giving people a place in the universe is when you have that gone, bad things fill the void,
Yeah.
bad other forms of meaning. And I think that's where we are now. I think people are very, you know, this kind of atomized individuality is really, really, really hurts, really is what leads to a lot of the unhappiness you see out there. You know, I mean, before this summer, I spent, to kind of pivot slightly differently, this summer I spent like, you know, over the last 2 years, I spent basically 3 months in working class Muslim neighborhoods overseas, one in Jakarta and the other in Istanbul, where religion was, you know, was very much part of the framework. It was just part of the fabric of the culture. And to spend, you know, 2 months in a place like that and then come back to the US is really jarring. You know, you go from a place where there's a natural organized community. People are, you know, despite the poverty levels, the income difference are happy or content as a way. And then you come to the US where, you know, there's an individuality that's kind of like, you know, you see people getting their freak flag on, which is great. I mean, good for them, but it also just kind of, it just really, you see a lot of depressed people, a lot of depression, a lot of loneliness. I mean, there is that in Jakarta, there is that in Turkey, but not to the degree there is that here. And it's just kind of shocking to come back and see it, you know, and you know, I really think that so many of our problems, and I don't want to be that person who looks at says this one thing. So many of our problems come from a lack of faith. You know, we haven't found a way to replace religion. I think secularism really thought like we didn't need religion at a very pragmatic level, and it's pretty clear we need it. And what's filling the void is not pretty.
And what I'm wondering is like with all the kind of social justice discourse that I'm hearing today places a lot of emphasis on, you know, on structures, on these, I guess we could say these measurable factors, which obviously play a role in exacerbating poverty and other social issues. But then I ask people like, okay, so we correct these structures, great, but then what do we do with the problem of meaning, the sense of existential emptiness and loneliness? Like, why is it that those who are most vocal right now, talking about social justice issues, are ascribing to this technocratic framework that doesn't make room for cultural capital and questions about like ultimate meaning in life.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of we fill the void of lack of religion with kind of politics in some senses. And I'm all for social justice. It's great. I think a lot of the stated goals are admirable. But they're, again, they're not doing they're in many ways they're just symbolic gestures people make to kind of ignore the bigger issues.
Mhm.
And so I am cynical that way. But also, I mean, the whole finding meaning by politics doesn't really, there's no regulation there. There's the classic role of religion is it's regulatory. It provides people with a guardrails in life. It provides people with and then there's also metaphysical. I mean, there's the frame, the answers to the big questions, the place in the universe, the meaning. And it just doesn't do that either. So it fails in those levels. And I think, again, the technocratic way of looking at the world, I think there's I forget which famous physicist basically said, um, you know, particle physics would be much harder if atoms had feelings,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
that's what the biggest problem is. You can't, I'm a former scientist. You can't do social science, and the technocrats are playing. I see them online and Twitter. They just don't get it. They don't get how people operate. They don't get that. To put it in their cold language, they don't understand people's utility functions. They don't understand how people work. And you can look at the COVID policy as an example of that. People need to be around people. And that was the whole kind of lesson of my McDonald's thing, that people form community in McDonald's because people want community that bad that they'll even do it in McDonald's. People need community. And, to deny people community is, on paper, okay, that's how we stop COVID in the room. But there's huge, huge costs for that. You deny people, and so technocrats don't understand people. They don't understand how people operate, and so but they have these models. Those models don't account for communities for how people work. You know.
Yeah, but then the other piece of this is that like so much of the way that, people are approaching these social issues is wrapped up in a very individualistic kind of narrative of like ultimately of like self-expression, authenticity, which is kind of the child of unfettered capitalism. It's this idea that I pursue my own goals without regard for some other ideal or for other people. And it's just interesting that, we're talking about trying to correct these social ills while furthering this individualistic worldview that just makes us even more lonely and ultimately makes us more vulnerable to oppression from those in power. You know,
Yeah, I mean, this idea that just do what you want to do because it feels good in every direction. I mean, it's really, again, it's not working for for majority of people. A lot of people I mean, it works for a minority who really get their kicks out of being very, very, very different. But people need to feel I always, the thing I always say is that the bumper sticker lesson of my work was people need to feel a valued member of something larger than themselves.
yeah,
And
we need to be
that's
rooted in
just
something that's not
sorry.
just, we need to be rooted in something that
Yep,
precedes us, not just me by
that's correct.
myself. Yeah.
That's right.
Mm. But so then, other than faith, you talk a lot about the role of family and place, like the local kind of community. And it makes me think about, so like the philosopher Charles Taylor talks a lot about what he calls, I guess, like the enchanted worldview that, reigned when religions played a central role in public life. And then, after the Enlightenment, more of this disenchanted worldview, this disincarnated worldview, and like the physical, mundane, everyday realities are no longer charged with some kind of deeper meaning. It's just like this positivistic, what you see is what you get. And I'm curious to understand more about how these more manual forms of work, more carnal ties like family, like local community, now lose value in this kind of excarnated technocratic worldview. And like I see a lot of younger working class inner city young people who are being pushed into these academic university tracks without being told that there's the option to do, some kind of vocational trade, and I just wonder, like, how much is that contributing to these problems, the fact that we're not valuing these other forms of these other cultural expressions.
The way you framed it, I mean, I haven't heard of the philosopher you were talking about, but really like the way you talked about it, because it's always nice to hear someone who uses better words than I've used to explain what I was trying to get at. Yeah, I mean, I always say that we've stripped a lot of kind of what I call non-credential forms of meaning, things that are family, place, nation, things that are kind of gifted to you at birth, natural communities. We strip them of their value, and we strip them of basically, we've turned them banal. They're very banal things. And the way you talked about it as, they're no longer magical in some sense. They're no longer filled with kind of, that's a very good way. And thinking back, it's really interesting. I'm going to have to go look that up, because I mean, that puts into, I've always said that one of the frustrations of, I'm a photographer, and one of the frustrations of photographing poverty, or what I saw was, the way most people photograph it is turn it into drama. Harsh black and white. They find the dramatic setting, but poverty is very banal.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of banality there, and it's trying to show that. And I think that gets at what you're saying, which is we have taken away the kind of magic of place, the magic of family, the kind of, and what I would argue is that people are fighting that. People naturally fight that. And they do that by creating art, natural art. They do that by creating their families and still imbuing them with kind of a special, I mean, that's kind of the whole, that's the choice of the idea of dignity. That's what I'm getting at, is that they still try, and that's a good way of thinking of how people try to maintain dignity, is trying to turn those kind of forms of meaning that are the technocrats, the value, they're fighting to buttress them and say, no, they still have value, not just, utilitarian value, but they have magical value. They have aesthetic value. They have like, you can't quantify value, and so that's certainly true when when I first got to the Bronx, what I tried to document was how amongst this banality, there's just still a beauty. Like, they were people were taking very kind of literally junk and creating art out of it, to uplift themselves, uplift the life, and turn that place into something that still mattered, turn their family into something that still mattered. And so you see that in terms like, pigeon keepers, the bike clubs, the even the graffiti art, and all sorts of things. And so I've always had a special awareness of that, because I do think people are fighting that. But yeah, I mean, I think, the story I always tell that I think is in the book, is a young woman who was 19, who was in a McDonald's. I met her, and she was East LA, Mexican American girl, woman, and she's talking about how she's going to East LA Community College, which I'm sure is a good school, but she wished she could go someplace else. She wished she could go to New York, where I was from, or what have you. And I asked her why she couldn't. She said, well, I'm my mother's translator. Like, I need to be there for my mother. And the question is like, I think, a technocrat would say, oh, we got to fix that. We have to find a way to go get her to New York.
Yeah.
And well, I don't know, man, is her decision to stay and be with her mother. Why is that viewed as a problem we have to solve? And I think one of my big frustrations, and I kind of addressed it when I reviewed a book that was similar to mine, but very different in many ways, Tightrope by Nick Kristof, who I guess is run in New York Times Up, who's running now for, like, I guess, New York, Oregon governor. And my frustration was he sees the problems I saw, which is admirable. I'm glad he saw them. But his solution is more education, more education. We got to get that, Black inner city kid into Harvard. We got to get them in education. He could only envision that he wants success as people like him. We need to turn everybody into somebody like him. We need to take all these kids, I'm like, no, people are different. It's like
Yeah.
we got to provide them with trade skills.
Yeah, it's
We
like,
we
why
got to
are we
provide.
assuming everyone wants that kind of career path? And also,
Yeah, I
like,
mean,
we have a society with people who are only engineers or economists, you know?
yeah, and I mean, or MFAs with lots of debt, or film majors. I mean, like we need to provide people, and yes, we have trade schools, but we need to make people. But anybody who tells you there's not a stigma attached to making the decision,
Yeah.
that we have to remove that stigma, where people are like, okay, that's admirable, you do that. Let's not funnel everybody into the Ivies as their dream. There's a lot of other forms of success, that and in many ways I think we again, going back to the original beginning of the conversation, we're the weird ones. Why are we trying to turn everybody into us?
Yeah. Have you ever seen the movie Lady Bird?
No.
That was like 3, 4 years ago. But this is exactly it. It's like it's this girl from Sacramento who, is like working up lower middle class, but like hates Sacramento because of how boring it is. She hates her parents. She hates her life. She wants to move to New York and have like this, fabulous, glamorous lifestyle. And the whole plot is like this tension between everything that's been given to her, which she perceives as mundane and just like boring, and this kind of ideal life she has envisioned for herself in New York. And eventually comes to realize, like, wait, this is kind of vapid. But I think that represents so many young people who they're conditioned to dream of this kind of life when really there is that magic or that enchantment hidden within what has been given. It's like, yeah, you kind of have to work to discover it, but it's there if we look.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I'm not saying you can't mesh the two. I mean,
Yeah.
you can stay in Portsmouth, Ohio, and still still experience literature, still especially nowadays, you still um, aspire, go, still travel, still see the world. But there's a way to have, quote, both of those experiences. But instead, what we do is we intellect, it's kind of what Patrick Janine and I were talking about. Like, I think this is his term I've stole, which is we intellectually strip mine the country.
Yeah.
Like, we find the best and brightest, et cetera, and we just take them out of there. We pull them out and throw them into, DC or New York or San Francisco or yes, or Cleveland, but only one or two neighborhoods in Cleveland. I mean, like, or Nashville, one neighborhood in Nashville, or Tampa, one neighborhood in Tampa. It's like we just, like, we have this kind of fast track to the front row, which is very same no matter where it is.
The other thing that I was thinking about, just like looking at my own experience, I grew up in a very suburban, kind of upper middle class neighborhood. And I was entrenched in this very front row worldview. Everything that I was taught was like, ultimately very technocratic. And I found interesting when reading Dignity that most of the areas you visited were either like more rural, more urban, inner city. And you see that these different kinds of environments breed these different ethoses or these different worldviews. So, like, I'm interested, what can you say about how the kind of space or neighborhood you in fosters a kind of mindset or way of seeing things?
Yeah, I mean, I think we make too much of the rural urban thing, because I think, as you pointed out, so many people live in suburbs now. That's kind of I don't even know how to define rural and urban. I mean, because there's that vast middle. I mean, Houston is like 90% suburbs. I mean, it's like, and LA is, I think LA, and like, you go, I'm not sure what suburbs is and what city is these days, but suburbs is where I think the majority of people live these days. And I tend to throw suburbs into the kind of rural camp. I think they have more of a rural mentality. I think I think you know I think they in some senses they have the worst of both worlds or the best of both worlds, depending on how you project it. But I think there's a strong there's a strong kind of there's a I personally find I personally find suburbs to be extraordinarily frustrating at a kind of aesthetic level,
Yeah.
in the sense that it's really hard to love that place, to find the magic in a suburb, because in many cases the technocrats have won, and the suburbs I know are over engineered,
Yeah.
almost impossible. Like, it's like, you know, I prefer the suburbs that where libertarians are in control, and like, you don't have 9 crosswalks and 15 berms and 37
Yeah.
turn lights, where it just feels like you're living in a corporate housing, like, it just, I think of Northern Maryland, or I think of like Southern Maryland, Northern DC area as kind of this place that's over engineered to the point of being kind of painful and depressing and oppressive. Um, I don't have a lot of love for the suburbs. Again, I know it's where I think a lot of people live, and I think it does shape you. I mean, you can't those things can't not shape your experiences, as well as also how you interact in communities. Like, are they natural forms? Are they natural community builders or not? But yeah, I didn't spend a lot of time in suburbs because I was trying to contrast kind of what I see the two extremes.
Yeah, because what I like when I look back at my experience growing up, like the way that the houses are set up, it's like I think the architectural realization of this atomized kind of worldview, because you have the option to interact with the people around you, but it's just like very guarded, very, like you have to cross this boundary intentionally. And then there's like certain standards and propriety that you have to consider. Whereas, when I ended up living in a city for my undergrad, yeah, there's loneliness, yeah, there's atomization, but it's different because like you're constantly surrounded by people. You're inevitably going to be interacting. And also like you're more free to express for like culture can be more freely expressed, whereas like when you're in your home, it's in suburbia, it's just so isolated. Or like in a more rural environment, at least I think you're more in touch with the land, so there's this sense that in those other kinds of environments it's very clear that something else is given to you, there's something else beyond you, whereas in suburbia everything's just like very man-made, very,
That's actually that's a much better answer than I give them, so I'm going to steal it. But I mean, that's very much, that is the case. That's exactly right. And I think it's, I used to quip that, and I'm sure other people have mentioned this. I'll drive through suburban neighborhoods where it's a row of ranch houses without a ranch. I mean, a ranch house is supposed to have a ranch. I mean, it's designed to have a ranch around it, right? I mean, that's why it's designed the way it is. And yet they're all next to each other, like, like 15 feet from each other. But there is a cold kind of like, I know, this cold sterileness to them. And again, I'm sure there's lots of community in them. Like, it's like me finding community in McDonald's. I'm sure they happen, like, at the Stewart shop here in upstate New York. That's where, or at the mall, or at the Walmart parking lot, or what have you. But or at the Starbucks, or at the strip mall. But you get the way I'd frame it is, suburbs are the neighborhood that's least conducive to forming community.
yeah.
Like, I mean, you can do it,
But yeah,
but
if you try really hard,
you got to fight it. Like, it's kind of like
it's
the
not
winds are
just done
blowing
that
against
way.
you.
Yeah. Mm. So one last thing I'll ask before we go. What would you say was the most surprising thing that you learned while traveling before writing Dignity?
Again, I think, well, I mean, the two obvious ones are the communities in McDonald's. Like
Mhm.
how essential McDonald's spaces are. A place that's built to be transactional, brutally capitalistic transactional, actually has communities in them. Like, that's how much people want community. And that was kind of the lesson of that. And then, I mean, to me, the other one was faith. It's just how essential faith is. And those are the two. The quip I used to say is, I kind of walked into this project kind of a, vegetarian atheist, and I kind of walked out, big McLovin Catholic. So, you know, um, so I mean, those are the two obvious things. On the more mundane thing is this kind of I think or less it's like how friendly people are. I mean, it's just, I kind of, if you're a stranger and you're driving 400,000 miles over 6 years around the country, just talking to people, I mean, people are extraordinarily friendly. And people want to tell you their story. And everybody who looks at there's some people have asked me what I did. Was it hard? Like, no, I mean, it's not hard to collect stories. People, if you have good intentions, people will tell you their lives. It's hard. The opposite actually was the case. There were times when I had to look, man, I just, I'm sitting at the Applebee's at 11:30, and people are talking at me, and it's really wonderful and that's sweet. I was like, I gotta go to sleep, man. Like, so it's actually not hard to collect people's story. People want to talk. And people are friendly and people want to talk.
Awesome. Well, Chris Arnade, thank you for joining us. And you can pick up his book, Dignity, and any social media plugs, Chris.
I guess I'm on Twitter now and then. And I just started a Substack, which I haven't posted anything to. I just started built the framework where I'm going to basically do some posting now. My Substack will be free. I'm not going to charge. I'll be posting on my future travels and various thoughts I have. But that's to come in the future. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you for listening to Praxis.
Thank you for having me so much. I really appreciate it. And I really like your answer on suburbs. I'm gonna have to think about it more.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, so thank you for listening, and we hope you've been sufficiently scandalized.